Hello there. Thank you all for joining us for another hard conversation had by the Black Girl's Guide to Healing Emotional Wounds. I am Nijiama Smalls, your host today, and always delighted to have these conversations because many of these conversations are relevant and necessary for not only just the Black community, but for our country and our world in general. Today, I am so delighted to have someone who I have been following for quite some time. Listen, I am going to read her bio, but she is just a powerhouse. As I always say, I am not smart. It is the people that surround me that are smart and they make me look good. And Shari is just one of those people. Her name is Shari Dunn. She is a journalist, an attorney, a news anchor, a professor, an executive consultant. She is a DEI leader, and she has just written the awesome book Qualify. So I am so delighted to introduce you to the wonderful Shari Dunn. Shari, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's really, I'm very excited to talk to you and your audience because Black women in particular were the impetus, the reason that I wrote this book. So, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. So we're just going to dive right into it. So Shari, tell us let's start off talking about DEI because DEI is,
Mhm.
that is the
In the
phrase, that is
news.
the acronym for 2025. Every time NBC or Google or CNN or MSNBC shoot me alert, DEI is in it. Tell everybody
Mhm.
what DEI is.
Well, I will use the plain language. Diversity is natural. It's in our world. It's in our bodies. It's diversity. It's the natural course of things. Without diversity, we'd all be dead. I mean, like seriously, like if you didn't have diverse genetic profile, an equitable world, meaning going beyond just equality, but understanding that some people have advantages, some have disadvantages. And we even have the concept of equity in our Constitution and in the law. The reason we have a criminal justice system that provides attorneys for people is because it would be inequitable not to do so, right? And inclusion is just simply just what it says, being inclusive of people. We have folks who have disabilities. We now, through the Americans with Disability Act, have the curb cut out. You can get your wheelchair and things in there. We have bigger stalls. We think about designing elements for tall, short people. That's inclusion. So the hysteria of diversity, equity, inclusion is something totally different. The hysteria of diversity, equity, inclusion is really related to people who are uncomfortable with and do not want to see the advancement of Black and other people of color, as well as women. And this critique of any advancement and inclusion of us has been going on since we were free from enslavement. So the critique of what people are talking about. And then there's just the practical workday DEI. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not the law. It doesn't mandate hiring, none of those things. It is a way that businesses and corporations try to think only really explicitly for the last 4 years about the impact specifically on anti-Black bias in the workplace and how that had been causing them not to recruit and hire some talented folks and making the workplace tolerable for people of color. So when you talk about DEI, there's a lot to unpack, but it is its plain language definition. It is the hysteria that people who are against an inclusive workforce and inclusive society, and then it's the practical day-to-day work that people do in their workplaces.
Absolutely great. It's so much you said there that even, you introduced me to some new pieces about DEI, especially the part about some of it is already embedded in our systems already, like, the court system, the legal
Yeah.
system, and so on, right? You don't think of it like that, but we're already, it's already a part of our culture. Talk to me about, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, the misconceptions about
Mhm.
surrounding DEI right now, because I see them all over social media. And I think
Right,
people
right.
just don't know what this is and what it isn't.
Yeah, it's not even misinformation, it's intentional disinformation. There are right-wing think tanks like the Claremont Institute based in California that have been working for years to undermine any attempts at an inclusive workplace or society. I mean, they did the same thing with affirmative action. Anything that is designed to open the doors of opportunity for Black people specifically is then recharacterized as lack unqualified, special treatment, this type of language. This language comes from these think tanks, and they have pushed it into mainstream society, and they've redefined the terms without any real pushback. For
Mhm.
instance, affirmative action does not and has not included quotas. This is a very common mistake. Oh, just affirmative action hire. There's no such thing. That's a lie. But it's a lie that has been repeated so much that I think even some Black people believe it. And as I said, this goes all the way back to when Black people were freed. The Freedmen's Bureau came about at the end of slavery to help Black people who were barely out of chains, no homes, no land, no nothing, get established in this new American society. And immediately, you can read about it in the book, there is pushback saying it's reverse discrimination to white people. I mean, in the book, I talk about a quote. They talk about recently and freed slaves had rights, but the only right they had was to starve because they had no shelter, no food, no nothing. I mean, people don't really think about that. So the Freedmen's Bureau was an equitable attempt to get the newly freed folks on their feet. And there was vicious pushback. And literally, you could take some of the things written about the Freedmen Bureau and just plop them right into DEI. It's the same language. It's the same thing. So that tells you that the pushback and the anger about DEI isn't about DEI a practice. It's about the goals of a racially inclusive workplace and society that acknowledges harm. That is not something that America likes to do. And so that is really a lot. Now, I do want to separate this out because there are bad diversity, equity, inclusion consultants and practitioners. There are people who've done bad work, sure. But let me tell you something. There are bad management consultants who've done terrible work, specifically as it relates to Black people in the workplace. And nobody's trying to outlaw what they do. There are terrible consultants, the ones who are leadership consultants who supposedly help corporations decide who could be a CEO on the leadership track. They do a terrible job assessing and understanding Black and other people of color. Nobody, says their work should be outlawed. So I'm not defending a specific practice. I'm saying it isn't about the practice because the practice of DEI isn't the issue. Because if that was the case, why does the critique of the Freedmen's Bureau after slavery and the critique of civil rights legislation and the critique of affirmative action and the critique of why do they all use the same language and sound like they were written at the same time? So that's a clue that it's not about DEI.
Exactly, exactly. And when I'm scrolling through socials, I see people saying, DEI, they're hiring all these unqualified people. And then you saw when planes go down or whatever and lives are lost, first thing we start talking about is DEI, right? And so for
Mhm.
me, I think people need to do the research. Like, do you truly understand what DEI is saying, what DEI is, and what it looks like in practice before you start critiquing? I mean, I think, even at the executive level, he doesn't even understand what DEI is. And so here we
Well,
are.
he he understands that he is in favor of a white supremacist society. He
Hmm.
understands that.
Right.
And so it doesn't matter
Hmm.
to him what DEI means. I mean, the end of Reconstruction in the United States, the period just before Jim Crow starts, is very analogous to today.
Hmm.
So a lot of people don't know that during Reconstruction, there was a Black US Senator. There were tons of Black Congress people. South Carolina had a majority Black state legislature. A lot of people don't know there was this period between during Reconstruction and before Jim Crow started, Black people worked in jobs, they lived in interracial communities, very similar to how we live today in some sense. And at that time, when Jim Crow started, they had the same thing. They were unqualified. They ran them out of Congress physically with threats of violence or simply fired them from their jobs. Black people were removed from their land, kicked out of ownership of their stores and property. So this has nothing to do with DEI. That's the problem. It has everything to do with a restoration of white supremacy
Mhm.
and fundamental assumptions that blackness itself is what is unqualified. It's not so much that people think the policy is unqualified as much as they just think blackness is unqualified. Because again, at the end of Reconstruction, the same thing. They blame it was black people. Having black people in the legislature was the reason America was doing bad. So they had to get rid it. That sounds just like today,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And it wasn't DEI. So I think people get lost when they chase this ball and don't focus on the fact that at its core, this is about dismantling an inclusive society and reinstating a society that looks, I think, like the current person in the White House said he would like to go back to 1789. I mean, he said that at a rally. 1789, Black people were half a century, a little more than half a century away from freedom.
Mhm.
So, if people want to
Mhm.
really know what's behind the anti DEI push, I called it like Scooby Doo. Pull the character's mask off, and it's just anti Black racism. And it's, not wanting an inclusive society.
Exactly, exactly. It's the same rhetoric from our past, from the Crow
Mhm.
era, that's just been repackaged and rebranded, but they're spewing
Yeah.
it out to us. But once again, if we don't do the deep dive in history and really
Hmm.
understand it, we don't know this. We don't know that we are
That's
supporting white supremacy when we are against these policies such as DEI and so on, because and that's the reason why they don't want correct history taught in our schools,
you're right.
and us to have
Right.
books like the 1619 Project and Qualified and so on and so on so forth, because it opens your mind to a completely different perspective that many in this country are just not ready to accept and admit. And I love that you call it white supremacy, because we need to start calling it out as it is, right? It's anti-Black.
Right. Anti-Black bias. And the thing of it is, just because you can see the country clearly doesn't mean you hate it.
Mhm,
I mean, this
exactly.
this is a real confusion, I think, with people. They feel like any critique of the United States means you don't like it. And in fact, I would say that people who critique the country in some sense love it, because if you didn't care, you wouldn't keep trying to figure out how to make it better, right? So yeah, I think you're right. It's this and it's education where most of us, and this is Black and white people, most of us know nothing about Reconstruction,
Mhm,
very little.
mhm,
Most of us do not know that the moment we are living in right now is almost a mirror image of the end of Reconstruction. Because where were we going to learn that?
mhm,
If they touched on it in school, they just said something real quick about carpetbaggers maybe, and then they went on to water fountains and Jim Crow.
mhm.
But knowing that piece would really have helped us maybe not get here. I don't know.
Exactly. I completely agree. And what you're talking about this, you know, in terms of not being able to accept the criticism, and they seeing the criticism and anti-American, that's fragility, right? It's you can't
Hmm.
handle that. It's just, they call it any critique or anything you talk about race or anything, it's divisive. That's because it's it's hitting you at the ego, right? It's hitting you where
Hmm.
it hurts. It's making you sit with some emotions and feelings that you never had to sit with before, and be able to stand up and say, America hasn't always done right by people, Black Americans, Indigenous people, and so on and so forth, right? And it may even make you check your own biases and your own reactions and
Hmm.
prejudices and so on. And that's hard for people, right? And
Yeah.
so not
It's
talking
scary.
about that is their way of us forcing us to continue to stroke egos and so on and so forth. um and so that's why we don't so there's progression. We get to these points like where we are right now in history, where it seems like we're
Hmm.
repeating ourselves because we're not taking
Yes.
the deep dives. And like you said, if you really love this country, right? It's like if you have a child, right? You love that child, you give them the good and the bad,
There you
right?
go.
That's a part of raising, that's a part of love, that's a part of maturing and
Hmm.
growing them up. Same as with our country. We should say we never want to repeat history. We should not even be talking about the golden years. That's done, it's over. We need to look forward, right? Because not everyone
Hmm.
progressed during the quote unquote golden years of whatever time frame
Hmm.
he's referring
Hmm.
to.
Hmm. No, that I love that analogy, and I talk about that also. That would you raise up your child and never give your child critique? Would you let a loved one do something so harmful and never say anything? Like that's not love. That's weird, right? But that's the way some people think you love a country is to never critique it, and that is, you know, just simply not true.
Not true at all. Not true. Like you said, you can love this country. Y'all hear that? You can love this country and you can acknowledge its wrongs and how it's wronged people. And you can make a proclamation that we're never going back there again. Yet here we are.
Hmm.
So, Sherry, talk to us about competency checking. What is that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, in my own work life, and I'm sure in yours and some of the folks listening, and in my consulting career, I was coming across people of color describing the exact same things happening to them. So, whether they were in the arts, whether they were in a corporation, whether they were in a government office, they were having similar language used about and against them. Things such as they were too aggressive, or they were too intimidating, or they were too full of themselves, or I mean, and I'm thinking like, how is someone on the East Coast, the West Coast, and down south all have the same evaluation? Like that's weird. And it could be a PhD person who's working at a university. It could be anybody. And so I thought to myself, this is something that needs to specifically be identified because if we say unconscious bias or racism, well, those are big topics, and like, okay, but what is that exactly? And even when we say confirmation bias, it's like, okay, but what does that mean? So in the book, I give the example. It's just like when you talk about housing discrimination, you have to know the specifics to have the specific cure. So if you say housing discrimination, okay, but what? Mortgage loan discrimination. Okay, now we're going to have that solution. Or if you talk about appraisal discrimination, right? So you got to break it down. So competency checking is my attempt to do that. And I like to just look in the book and give the proper definitions so that people know what I mean when I say it. And the crazy part is this one definition that usually when I say it, the person listening, if they're Black, they know the second part. So we'll see if you do this. There are three primary ways competency checking shows up. The first is the assumption of Black intellectual inferiority or lack of qualification. So people just assume. And that manifests as low expectations, marginalization, and extreme micromanagement, right? People just checking on you all the time. If someone assumes consciously or unconsciously that all Black people are intellectually inferior, they're going to question that person and their qualifications more closely during the interview. And once hired, they pay more attention to your work, looking for any mistakes. The second method of competency checking is the expression. And this is where people have surprise or unease with Black intelligence. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you know that, which can trigger requests or demands to confirm how did you learn that, whether it's rote memorization or actual knowledge. And this can manifest as dismissal, quizzing, argument, tokenization. If a Black person knows something that their white coworker doesn't know, the coworker's reaction isn't, I didn't know that, but more often it is, do you know what the reaction is?
Uh,
It's not, I didn't know that, but more often it
how
is,
did you know that? No.
Yes. Look, how do I know you know that?
Yes.
First, let me just
Questioning
stop
your
for a
intellect. Yeah.
second and tell you that I have said this in multiple rooms now. And the first time I read that sentence, before I could get the words out of my mouth, it was a room full of Black women. They
Mm-hmm.
yelled it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh my gosh. See, that's my point. This is happening to Black people all over the place. And they're literally getting the same language. So the final and third method of competency checking is activation, specifically the feeling of fear when confronted with a Black person who holds any authority, especially someone in a leadership position. This can manifest as a request for identification, undefined feelings of unfairness, anger, unease, and what I describe as an autoimmune level rejection of Black leadership. So those are the three elements of competency checking: assumption, expression, and activation. And basically what happens to Black people in the workplace, and to some extent white women and other people of color, is this constant request to confirm, because the assumption is you don't know. The assumption is you're not intelligent. The assumption, and whether it's spoken or unspoken. And so consequently, people put up all these barriers for you to prove what you know. And I say in the book, the pipeline isn't broken or empty, it's blocked. It's blocked with competency checking and with filters that people, Black folks particularly, have to try to wiggle through to get through. And then you say, oh, there's no one in the pipeline, which is totally untrue.
Absolutely. Wow. So much to unpack there. I know anyone who is listening can relate to this. As you're talking, so many different examples in my own personal experience
Mm-hmm.
popped up in my head. I can recall I used to be on a marketing team, and we would go travel marketing this program. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was in Texas, in Dallas, Texas, doing a presentation, and I was in my early 20s then, fresh out of college. And I remember this woman who was in the audience emailed me, and she was a white woman. She was like, "I was just so impressed with you, and you speak so clearly, and so on." And I was like, in my young mind, I'm trying to wrap my mind around what she's saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, if I was a white woman, would she have sent me the same email? Like, and this was like we were conversating back and forth about, her coming on to the program and so on, her company. And she kept saying that I've always just been so impressed with
Mm-hmm.
you. Like, huh?
It's a compliment.
Yeah.
And I think the thing of it is, here's the thing: you're there as a trainer.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
clearly you know how to train. And then you have graduated from college. So then the question does become, what is she filtering this experience through? Because there's some sort of filter, and I call it a racial distortion
Mhm.
filter. There's a filter of racial distortion that, is there because, and I've had white people say to me, well, what if she meant that she wished she was a better public speaker? Okay, well, say that. Because if a person said that,
Mhm.
then we're not having a conversation
Right.
about this,
Yeah.
right? Because you would have been like, oh, let me tell you how I do it.
Mhm.
But it isn't. It's a more of a paternalistic
Mhm.
thing. Like, oh, I mean, this is how it sounds to me. I don't know how it sounds to other people, but it sounds to me like someone says, oh, I didn't know a dog could talk. Look at that talking
Yeah,
dog.
exactly. No, exactly. That's what it is. It's like when I stood up at the podium, she didn't expect what came out of my mouth came out of my mouth, right?
It's,
And so it's like one of those, you think this is a compliment, but it's really not, right? And so
it's
as
very much insult.
yeah, and I think in the Black community, we have so much pressure that I don't think others understand that we have to deal with. Some of the things you just addressed,
Mm-hmm.
when we walk into predominantly white corporate spaces, we have to go
Mm-hmm.
in there knowing at that moment we have to prove ourselves, right? And it's like,
And
mama,
we have to identify, who are we?
who are we?
Why are we here?
Right,
Why are you
exactly.
here?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And you have to do all the things to let people know, A, that you earn a seat at the table, and B, that you can maintain that seat at the table, because you never know what folks come into the room with in terms of their own biases and prejudice that they have never checked. And especially, people will say, organizations have this blanket term, so and so wasn't a good fit. They created that term, right? we didn't create that term, they created that term, but what does that really mean, right? Who are they talking about? It feels like it's this blanket term that they can use at whatever whenever they can, when it's someone that doesn't fit what they have in their mind, and they can cast them out and just
Mhm.
say, they just weren't a good fit, right? And so we have
Mhm.
to be
Yeah.
mindful
And
of
they
that
and
term when someone's that phrasing, when they say that, and challenge them and say, well, what is a good fit? How am I not a good fit?
what do you mean? One of the things I describe is that, let's say a Black woman comes into an interview and they're talking about themselves in a good way. You will often hear people say, "Oh, well, she seemed full of herself," or "She's so, this or that." And then the thing to say is, "Well, wait a minute, isn't an interview the time a person is supposed to talk about themselves?
Mm-hmm,
And are we punishing other people for talking about themselves?"
mm-hmm,
You know what I mean? So it's just so ingrained, into how it's almost like, when I mention it and talk to white people about it, it's almost like they like wake up. Like,
mm-hmm.
I think it's almost like people are in a bit of a trance when they interact with us, which is crazy. But you know, you can have a Black person, and this is why I think it happens. You can have a Black person explain something in a room, and people act like they didn't hear it. And then a white person will say the exact same thing, and then people hear it.
Mm-hmm,
Now, white women talk about this happening to them, but the irony is they also do it to Black people.
mm-hmm,
They also, so it's like people almost shut off listening.
mm-hmm,
And then if you try to say, well, wait a minute, well, you don't need to take credit for everything. Well, wait a minute, I'm not getting credit for anything. I'm not trying to take credit for everything. I'm just trying to take credit for what I said,
right. Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Exactly. And there's always in our head, right? We're always in our head because we have to be. Am I coming across as too aggressive? How do I assert myself in this way that it doesn't offend anyone, right? There have been so many times in my experiences that I have felt that I have dim my light or tone myself down to make sure that I was making everybody else comfortable around me, right? I didn't say, you let the microaggression slip by you. Someone says something crazy about your hair. Oh, how did you get your hair like that? Or whatever, and you just ignore it, or I did this, and in your mind, you're thinking, why do I have to sit here and have this conversation with you? Well, I
Hmm.
remember one day I told one girl, I said, she asked me about my hair. I said, listen, this is not getting ready to be ask a Black girl about her hair day. We're not doing this, right? But we have to be mindful because you can cross that line, and that line can truly mean the end of you, right?
You're correct.
And
That's
that's the
right. That's
thing.
right. It's really that. Yes, you hit upon the nail on the head. Because people are trying to maintain their livelihood, their life, and as we move into an even more hostile work environment under the current
Mhm.
administration, I think it's going to get harder. And telling people, YouTube is a great resource to learn about Black hair.
That's a
You
good
can just
answer.
go to Google, YouTube
Google. You
and
don't have
Google.
to
You
ask
don't
me
have to.
that. Google
Yeah,
that.
just ask Google or go to YouTube, and you can watch videos. You can totally go down the rabbit hole, learn everything you need to know. But I think the thing that strikes me the most is how the fact that you can ask almost every Black person in the United States and they can repeat similar language said to them. And I think that was the thing that really got me. And what and I was saying that Black women are I say in the book that Black women are the canaries in the workplace coal mine, because they used to send a canary down to see if the coal mine was poisoned. If the canary died, nobody could go down there. Black women are being shed out of the workplace at an alarming rate, and that was prior to this administration taking office. So I'm terrified as to what is going to be happening in the next few months. And this is because Black women show up with education, with experience, with everything, and they are just, and part of it is it almost doesn't matter what you do. Like, even if you try to, twist yourself into a pretzel so people feel comfortable, I tell people, I could say good morning and people hear,
Mm.
like, I didn't even say that. Like, like they're hearing an interaction with me that's not happening. So it's kind of tough. And I think the roles and responsibilities really need to be on companies and dominant culture, which is white people, to really understand the ways in which they are blocking the natural flow of talent that would see. I always tell people, if you assume that diversity, equity, inclusion, or affirmative action, or civil rights, or the Freedmen's Bureau, or any of that existed because Black people are unqualified and need special help, then you misunderstand the problem. Because if you misunderstand the illness, you can identify the symptoms as opposed to the illness. So, in other words, if the symptom is a fever, well, I would say, oh, that's because she's, a witch. I don't know. You just make something up. But if you don't say, no, the illness is the flu, right? So if you misidentify the illness, you can come up with any reason. The illness is not that Black people are inherently unqualified. The illness is that white supremacy has consistently blocked advancement and access for qualified and unqualified Black people. Like, Black people got a right to be good and bad at their job, just like white people.
Exactly.
So white supremacy has blocked the natural flow. So these things exist to remove what are in fact artificial blockages. And so Black women tend to identify these issues. They tend to come with the experience, and they just are getting they're having a bad time. They're having a really difficult time, especially in corporate spaces, and the rate at which they're being shed out of those spaces is alarming. And so Black women were the reason I wrote this book, hands down, because I was like, what in the world? And then when you look at the data from other countries like the UK, you see similar data, and
Yep.
you're like, okay, so this has been a worldwide problem,
Absolutely, absolutely. Tell us about give us a few examples of what biases in hiring systems look like.
Yeah. So one of the blockages I talk about in the pipeline is this prestige bias for universities. So it a decade ago, the United States was graduating more Black and Hispanic students in computer science degrees than showed up in employment, specifically in kind of prestige employment, so Google, Meta, etc. So the typical statement is, oh, there's not a pipeline of Black computer science engineers. Well, the percentage who are graduating was not showing up represented. So why is that? Mainly because many of those businesses tended to want to hire people who had either went to or dropped out of, because we know these stories of white people who dropped out of famously Harvard, the more elite institutions. Well, those institutions have fewer Black people, and I just saw some data post affirmative action. There's almost few to none at Harvard, and I think it's Harvard Law. So I mean, we are in a 10 alarm fire right at the moment regarding the future of our livelihoods that I don't think people fully grasp. But so it's the prestige bias that blocks these engineers. And like I said, it was a study a decade ago, and one of the teachers, I don't know if he was at the University of Houston or one of the schools, he said, my students are capable, they have great grades, they are not second rate, they are doing internships, but that prestige bias blocks it. Another block in the workplace that I don't think many of us really think about is referral based hiring. Now, referral based hiring on the face of it seems harmless. You just refer people you know. But in fact, referral based hiring is a race based hiring system that almost exclusively favors white people. And 30 to 40% of all hiring is done through referral based hiring. What we know about referral based hiring is more informal. People are more likely to give you a break. And it's not that white people aren't referring Black people because they're being this everything relates to something, right? So because of housing discrimination patterns, because of education segregation, we don't tend to live near each other or know each other as friends. And so most white people's friend group, I think, is like 90% white. So In fact, referral based hiring becomes a de facto white hiring system that allows white people a more less formal way into employment in fairly large numbers. Now, people say, well, black people, they could just refer people. Data tells us it don't work like that. So number one, there aren't enough black people in many of those corporations to do that. Number two, when black people do refer people, their referrals don't end up treated the same. Racism comes up again. So what we find is that referrals from black people tend to either not get interviews or not get as far as referral from white people in the same system. So it's not that simple. It's not as simple as having black people just refer black, because they don't get the same result. So, one thing I suggest is limiting referral based hiring, because this means then that Black and other people of color have to come in the front door of a job, which is way more formal, a lot more scrutiny, way more competition, more. So they're going through a sieve that is smaller and narrower. So by the time it gets there, you say, "Oh, the pipeline's empty." No, honey, you've removed whole sections of this pipeline for this side, and that's just flowing through. But this side, it's a trickle because you narrow it, narrow it, narrow it until it becomes a trickle, right? So I think, those are just two examples that prestige bias in the way referral based hiring impacts the workplace.
I have personally seen referral based hiring. I used to be in talent acquisition years ago, and I worked
Mm,
for one of a very large IT company, and we were hiring for a position, and the hiring manager was a white male, and we had a slew of candidates that we presented to him. One in particular who was awesome, well qualified, was a black woman. He chose, however, to hire his neighbor who had been a
mhm.
stay-at-home mom. No disrespect to the stay-at-home moms, but she had been a
Yeah,
stay-at-home
no,
mom.
it's not the
She had
point.
no she did her resume put up against this other woman did not even match.
Hmm.
And he not only hired this woman, but he put her in at the top of the salary bracket. And it was myself
Hmm.
and a couple of other white women who saw this, and we all were like dropping, like, really? We were all confused, but it was right in our face. But it was one of
Hmm.
those things
Hmm.
where if
That
I
people
say
don't.
something, what's going to happen to
Hmm.
me if I say something about
No,
this?
right,
So
right.
you just
Yeah.
let it go,
I
right?
mean, when you think about the fact that referral hiring accounts for 30 to 40% of all hiring, you can see how this happens. And this is the false narrative that affirmative action or DEI or any of that is getting people with lack of qualifications. In point of fact, to your story, the black person comes to this scenario with more qualification, more education, more skill, and still doesn't get hired. And Bureau of Labor Statistics data proves that. So now the book, as you will know, has 45 pages of citations because
Yes.
I knew if I said things, people had to check. However, some of my federal citations could be gone because the administration has deleted or made inaccessible race-based data in the federal government. So some of the data in my book may not either exist or be accessible because they have removed it. But the Bureau of Labor Statistic data from 2019, as analyzed by the Economic Policy Institute, proved that Black people tend to be underemployed. What that means is they tend to be in positions that are not commensurate with their level of education or experience. But a white person with a high school or undergraduate degree tends to be employed in positions that would normally, you're looking for undergraduate or graduate
Mhm.
degree. So you have white people actually are the ones who are in jobs without commensurate qualifications, experience, or skill, and Black people in jobs with the qualification skills not in their level. So race remains a determinant factor, is
Mm.
basically what the report shows.
Well,
So it's not just Black people's imagination.
well, isn't that interesting? But see, these are the conversations that people aren't having because they're thinking race is, talking about race and having these deep dive conversations are harmful, but really they're not, because they're eye
Mhm.
opening and they're helping us to check our own perspectives, right? And so this is why this is so powerful. Um, and so DEI is, under attack. What do we do? Is there anything we can do, Shari? I mean, aside,
Mhm, mhm.
we understand elections matter and so on, but
Mhm.
what can we do?
Mhm.
Those of us who are working in professional settings, even in our community, what do we do now?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think to the point of your podcast, I think it's healing to have these
Mhm.
conversations. I know that I had an early reader, a young woman in the UK, and when I just had the manuscript, and she sent me back an email at the time. She said, "This made me mad, sad, angry, but most of all, it made me realize I wasn't going crazy." And I think for a lot of Black folks who are in isolation in places, even though we know about racism, it's still, like you said, it's still a shock. It's still confusing. And I think part of this is an affirmation that you are not only not going crazy, but that this is happening to all of us almost. And these are the ways. So I think that helps in a bit. It helps in a way. Take some of that loneliness off. And then I think we need to interrogate the ways that we competency check each other as Black and other people of color. I think we need to look at the ways white supremacy shows up in us in spaces and find ways to help each other. We cannot afford to continue to look at ourselves as the only in this space, or crabs in a barrel kind of mentality with each other. We are going to need to help each other now more than ever. And that doesn't mean that we put up with bad behavior from each other, but it means, if there's a way we can help each other, we need to break down the walls to try to do that. I think those who work in HR, talent acquisition, or those who are even in senior executive levels need to ask questions. I always say ask more questions, and that could be really helpful. So maybe if you're part of a hiring team, you could say, I noticed that, this month we did 20% referral based hiring. But we our traditional routes are, we've only done 10%, and that seems to be where we get most of our diversity. I wonder if there's a way we can expand that, right? So you're asking questions. Like to you, what you're saying, you're not accusing anyone. You're saying, this is what I noticed. I read this book, Qualified, and I noticed this. And during interviews, if people notice conversation like, "Oh, she seems full of herself," or da da da, that's interesting. That's an interesting take. But interviews are probably the time. And are we holding everybody to that standard? You know what I mean? So asking more questions, inquiring with people, helping them reflect back what they may not unconsciously realize, and calling out instances of competency checking. If somebody says, "Oh, I just felt she was so angry," and you could ask, "Well, that's interesting, because I didn't tell me what were the indicators to you of her anger. I'm just, I'm curious, like, how did you see what I'm saying? Like, you're really trying to do something called motivational interviewing, which is ask people why they think what they think, as opposed to saying, "Well, I don't think that, that's a lie, I think that's racist." Okay, like, that's not going to work, right? But if you trying to get them there to the same place, but you're asking different questions. And then, I talk about the fact that women, Black women and white women, really do need to find some way to bridge this gap that exists between us. And I talk about the book about unmasking imposter syndrome, which I think is very destructive to women and white women in particular. And because systems change is the only way we're going to do this. And when it comes to women, there are equal to, if not more, women in the workplace than men in many workplaces, and yet they don't work collectively together to make significant change. So those are some of the things. They're not all the things, but some of the things.
Yes. And I hear a lot of white women say that they're our allies or accomplices or whatever the case is. But show us that in action. And it's okay, challenge. If you see something weird, it's okay to do what you said and ask the hard questions. What do you mean by angry? What do you mean by aggressive? if it was me, would you say that? Ask the questions to get them to
Mhm.
think about what it is they're saying and what they're getting at. And I love you say, challenge um, your white supremacy thoughts, because white supremacy is
Mhm.
so ingrained into our culture.
Mhm.
I even have to check my own thoughts, right? um
Right, of course. Of course.
and just even in terms of what I'm saying to my children and so on, I have to check myself, and I'll say, wait a minute, where did that come from? Who is this benefiting? Those kinds of questions I have to ask myself. So, and I don't think people understand how deeply ingrained it is in us. And when we're
That's
acting out on those behaviors, it's okay for someone to call you out on those behaviors. We need to normalize that, calling people out on
mhm.
those behaviors and being able to say, help me to see what you don't see. I mean, or help me to
Mm.
see what I don't see.
Yeah.
And I think that is a
Yeah,
way we
what
can
am I
bridge the
missing?
gap.
Yeah, what am I missing? And I also think white women have to stop seeing themselves as allies and understand that they have a dual role.
Hmm.
They have a role of as a victimizer and a victim.
Hmm.
And they can be both victimizers and victims. And so they need to check that victimizer that lives in them because it's historical. I mean, Black people were the first piece of property white women could ever own in the United States was
Wow.
Black people, right?
Interesting.
So white women do have to check that, but they're also victims of this system.
Hmm.
They're also victims, and they don't seem to catch that if this system falls for us, it falls for them.
Facts.
If it falls for us, it falls for them. And so they don't need to be my ally, because that to some extent that they're in it. They need to figure out how to get in it with us,
Right.
because this is your fight too. And the fight against anti-Blackness, I always tell people, liberates not just Black people, but everybody. That is the distinction. The fight against anti-Blackness doesn't just liberate Black people. Every time in the United States we've tried to address anti-Blackness, other people have benefited.
Oh,
And people do
100%.
argue other people benefited more, right? So, in order to make freed Africans, citizens, we bring in the birthright citizenship, which Donald Trump's trying to get rid of,
Hmm.
because people actually have been trying to get rid of it since we became citizens.
Hmm.
There's a whole string of white supremacist thought that does not like birthright citizenship because it goes back to us becoming citizens. That being said, millions of white people are American citizens through the story of immigration to the United States because of birthright citizenship,
Hmm.
because of anti-black bias, addressing anti-black bias. You know, I talk about, those with disabilities. The disability rights movement modeled itself off the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers helped the disability rights advocates on sit-ins. Um, there is nothing that anti-black fighting against anti-black bias has ever done negatively in the United States for white people. White women, as we all know, have been the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action
Hmm.
because they were included in the legislation as a poison pill.
Hmm.
A Southern Democrat put women in because he thought that it would kill the legislation. So they benefit and have benefit. And I'm not. Some people say this and they say it like, "Oh, I'm mad at them." I'm still mad at white supremacy. I'm not going to fight down here. I'm really more interested up
Right.
here. But what I wish is that more white women either understood or were vested in this fight, because it is their fight just as much it is our fight.
Absolutely. 100%. Well said. Shari, where can we find your book?
Yeah, well, it is available everywhere books are sold. So Amazon, bookshop.org. Check with your local bookstores, community bookstores. It's generally available everywhere books are sold. It's on Audible, so it's audiobook, and it's on other audio platforms, so you can listen to it. If you want to find out more about me, I have a website, which is the SHARIDUNN.com. So the ShariDunn.com. I also have a Substack subscription where I'm going to be doing a study guide later this month, starting about the book, so people can learn more about the book.
Absolutely. Thank you. This has been a truly enlightening conversation. I could talk to you all day, Shari. Listen, sisters, please go out. Let's get this book. This is great for our book clubs. My Mocha moms who's out there listening, we need to get all of our chapters to read this book. And in our book clubs, we need to be reading this book. D9, y'all get this book. This is a book, and even our white sister friends, y'all need to read this, have this
Mhm.
conversation. If you know of any organization that really wants to understand how to do DEI the correct way, because as Shari has said, there is an incorrect way, y'all reach out to Shari Dunn and take a call with her. She is phenomenal, and her book is also chock full of statistics and data to support what she is saying. Thank you, Shari, for your time. This has
Thank
been
you.
wonderful. Thank you all for listening today. Join me, stop by the Black Girl's Guide to Healing Emotional Wounds for resources, and I will have Shari's book there listed so that we can all go out and purchase. Thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day.